powered by Communitech. From Waterloo region in Ontario, Canada to the world. The conversations you need and want to hear with interesting people on topics at the intersection of technology and humanity. Tech for good. Let's get started.
Thank you, Talia, and welcome everyone to True North TV. It's Tuesday at noon. We got a very special guest with us today. We have Patty McCord. And for those of you who have spent some time at Communitech, you probably have seen Patty before, appearing at some of our conferences. She was the Chief Talent Officer at Netflix for 14 years, and she produced something called the Culture Deck, which now has been viewed over 15 million times. Sheryl Sandberg said it probably is the most important document to come out of Silicon Valley in the last 50 years. It certainly has had an impact. It's had an impact about the way we think about culture, about the way that we think about managing teams and building teams, and the relationship between the corporation and the individual. Patty, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Ian. Thanks for having me.
So much has changed, although, you know, we started out by pointing out the fact that we do have a doodle from the last time you were here, and you taught us all kinds of things about the difference between, you know, being part of a family and part of a team. We've just been through, we're in the middle of a pandemic. What have you been thinking about? What has changed in your world around, you know, the future of work?
Well, you know, when I travel around the world and I talk about changing things and throwing things away and trying things differently and innovating. After I speak, I always go out in the audience and someone will say, well, that's all sounds really great, but I can't, you know, my company's too bureaucratic. We can't try new things. We're stuck in my CFO won't, my CEO won't, I don't have a seat at the table. I can't. And then all of a sudden, you know, we can't work from home, right? We can't work remotely. And then boom, like, we sure can, right? And what I'm really finding out as I'm talking to people is I'm really trying to emphasize that people know that this is a muscle that we always had, we just never used. And remember this moment when first of all, nothing's going to ever go back to normal. But let's say we're past this, and on the other side, when people say we should try something different, remember that you can.
Interesting you should say that, Patty. I think that you know, one of the things that has changed so much is this notion that, you know, proximity is now optional. And I wonder, you know, I mean, if all of a sudden, you know, we can hire people sort of anywhere, they don't need to move because we know how to work virtually. Now, it'd be nice to get to some sort of hybrid where we actually could see people on an ongoing basis. But how do you think this is going to affect the way that, you know, people do firm formation and access global talent and where they live?
I don't know, but we're finding out, right? I mean, I'm here in the Bay Area, and most companies that I know were set up to do remote work anyway. They just never thought everybody would be doing it. And, you know, back when you and I talked, I was talking about it's a team, not a family. And I think it's really interesting now watching the families in the middle of, you know, my son is working from home with my 9-month-old granddaughter, and they insist that she be part of every meeting now. But then they want her to go away, and it's really hard to manage. You know, he tells me, he's like, I'm just exhausted. It's just all the time. I wish I kind of miss being in my car by myself commuting, because it's the one time somebody doesn't need me. So I think we're learning a lot of different things. You know, I was thinking back the other day to remember when the sort of thing du jour was to figure out how to do meetings and who should be at meetings and what agendas should look like and how people should participate and blah, blah, blah. All these books are written about it. And now I'm thinking, well, the idea of making meetings virtual on Zoom may or may not be a good idea. You know, some people say, if I do another Zoom call, I swear to God, It's just too many faces. I can't do it. And then I talked to another CEO last week who said to me, I do my quarterly meetings now on Zoom. And he said, I literally see everybody in the company instead of in front of me on stage. And he said, so when I did the Q&A the other day, this person asked this really great question. And I didn't know them. And I said, who is that? And some junior. He's like, I felt like I really was in touch with everybody in my company for the first time. So it's a lot of changes all the time. I'm recommending to people that you journal it. You write down every day something that you learned or something that didn't go well or something that did go well, and just constantly regurgitate that stuff all the time, because we'll get better like we do with everything else.
It's interesting. I mean, early on, we went home, I think, on March the 12th or something. And it was one of the things that struck me was that, there's a loss of intimacy, but then there's an additional different kind of intimacy in the relationships. You mentioned your son and the grandchild. Now we know the children's names of people who are on our team. We see inside their homes. There's almost a heightened level of intimacy, or a very different dimension of intimacy. Before, we would often keep our faces in a jar by the door, and that's gone.
Yeah. And the whole idea of that you become an employee when you walk in the door. There aren't any doors anymore. So, I mean, how I think those relationships are really going to be examined. And I think we've been working virtually and globally for a long time. I mean, that's nothing new. The idea that we can do it as a matter of course, that's what's new. I mean, ask anybody who has a global workforce. Somebody's up in the middle of the night. I know that when I do work with India, it's always very difficult, because for one of us, it's 11:30 at night. It just has to be. That's how you do it. So I think we're learning a lot about that. The other thing is, I think we're starting to pay better attention to deliverables, and parsing work out in chunks that we can measure, partly because we can't see into the future very well. And I think that's really helping people tighten up the way they manage. The other thing that I'm really, swells my heart is that, okay, these guys are adults. They're going to do work without you paying attention to them. You don't have to drop by and see that they're at their desk.
Fully formed, well-functioning adults, or something like that. Isn't that what you like to talk about?
Yeah, it's exactly what I like to talk about. And this we can't. My people won't. Your people are certainly doing it right now. And people that are working are pretty happy to be working.
Yeah, we have something called radical transparency at Communitech, where we make everything available to everyone. And I think it's just about, trust. You just trust that. I mean, it was in the 90s. I was working for a big global company, and of the 150 people who worked for me, 2 sat in the same office as me, and the rest were scattered around the globe. And so, it is, the difference, as you say now, is that this is at scale. I guess one of the things that people are challenged with right now is how do you retain culture at a time like this, because you don't have the, everything is a meeting with an agenda, and then you get off the damn thing as quickly as possible. But you don't have the sort of that other dimension of social. And so people have tried things like, trivia games and, beers on Fridays, and all kinds of different ways, and keeping people connected. But I know that a lot of people, I just had my CEO roundtable peer-to-peer group last week, and a lot of people are talking about how do we retain the culture that we built, and what would be some tips and tricks that we could put to work?
I think we just got to pay attention to it. It has to be on our agenda like everything else is. Have I told you my Scott Bowman story? So you know who Scott Bowman is, right?
Scotty Bowman, yep.
Scotty Bowman. So I did a talk in Montreal a couple of years ago, And it was in February. And I called my daughter. I'm like, hey, I'm doing this thing in February. And she says, Mom, go to Patagonia, get a puffy coat, get the big one. I had no idea any place on earth got that cold. So I stayed at a hotel where I could go underground to the venue where I was speaking, and that venue was the Bell Center. I have no idea what this is, right? I'm an American. I live in a coastal town. I don't know nothing about hockey. And I go underground and I'm in the green room and Scotty Bowman's there and we meet, and he's a lovely 70-year-old man in a rumpled suit with a, maple leaf pin and American flag pin. And he says to me, Patty, we're under the ice. And it had never occurred to me that we were in a hockey stadium. I mean, never. So I go up on stage, they introduce me, and my face is on the Jumbotron. It's like, oh my God. But I have Botox face, so I maintain, I'm HR, right? So I go sit down, everybody claps politely. Scotty Bowman comes on stage, and you can imagine, I'm at the Bell Center in Montreal with Scott Bowman. The crowd goes bananas, right? If they had foam fingers, they'd be waving them. And people are stomping and taking selfies. And you're Canadian, you understand all this. I don't understand this. So he sits down next to me on the little sofa, and the moderator says, Mr. Bowman, you've coached so many of the greats. You've won so many tournaments. We're such admirers of your work. How is it that you coach your teams to such greatness? How do you give them feedback? And he said, well, we play an 80-game season, and every 10 games I sit down with each player. They do an evaluation. I do an evaluation. We talk about the other team members. We talk about who we're going to play in the next 10 games, what we've done well, what's working well. And then we put together a plan, a performance improvement plan, so that the team can improve and continue to succeed. And the moderator says to me, Patty McCord, it's said that you hate the annual performance review, and you know that I do. And he said, what would you do instead? And I said, what he said. So I think it's that we have to make a plan, and we have to literally put it on our calendars to reach out to people. I mean, I told you about my friend at TED. She said that her team, they have coffee on Friday mornings, and they just go around and go, how you doing? That stuff that you would do if I ran into you at the coffee machine. And that's the stuff that we now have to kind of schedule and plan so that we just stay in touch with each other.
Well, it certainly is a new dimension to not just how do we manage people, but even things like onboarding people and orienting them in the midst of all of this and at a distance. It's remarkable, though, how we have learned about this pandemic and how we've adapted, and we've gotten pretty good at a lot of different things. What's the one thing that's kind of surprised you about this that you didn't expect, that you didn't see coming? Whether it's sort of the response of humanity, or whether it's the way that organizations are thinking differently.
Oh, I think we can't separate the pandemic from all the other social things that are happening in the world right now. I mean, it's almost overwhelming. I'm trying to figure out if I can actually take a non-social media day off, because it's just, so I think that we can't separate what's happening in our corporations from what's happening in society, from what's happening with employment itself. I mean, my daughter works at a bakery. She's an essential worker, and we're now on our 8th day from her getting tested. 8 days. I live in California, and she's going to work every day, right? So there's just those kinds of things, we just didn't deal with in public with each other anymore. I want to separately make a note about onboarding. Sure. So in the introduction, you introduced me as the writer of the Netflix culture deck, and that's not true. How we wrote the culture deck was, it took 10 years to write it, and we wrote it collaboratively. So Reed Hastings, who's the CEO of Netflix, and I would brainstorm, let's talk about the behaviors that we value and let's write stuff down. That was our big deal that we were going to do differently at Netflix because we would work together at another company. So we wrote stuff down. So we'd write the chapter on the things that we value, and we discuss it with the rest of our executive team. And then we talk about it with our leadership team. And then we talk about it with the rest of the company. And because it was PowerPoint, we could edit it. So we rewrote the first chapter about things that we value 6 times when I was there, right? So if you go back and look at it again, every chapter is written, the chapter before it, you mentioned fully formed adults, right? Adults that are mature. We could not have freedom and responsibility unless we had high-performing adults in the company, right? So it took that part, having high-performing employees, for me as the head of talent, took me 4 years to figure out. Right? I had to be able to figure out a severance program. I had to have a killer recruiting team. I had to have managers who could set goals that were, achievable and could communicate them. I had to get myself out of the process of figuring out great teams. I had to start talking about great teams. The reason I'm telling you this story is that was our onboarding document. That's why we wrote the Netflix culture deck. And then one day, true story, one day, Reed picks me up because we carpool together. And he said, we're driving along, and he says, I met this woman at this dinner last night who has this really cool company. They're putting PowerPoint slides online. It's called SlideShare. And I said, oh man, that's a great idea. I wish I had thought about that. I wonder what people are going to put out there. And he said, oh, I put the deck out this morning. And I said, what? Oh no, that's why did you do that? And he said, well, what's wrong with it? I said, oh, Reed, it's the ugliest document known to humankind. I mean, it's just, I don't even think the fonts are the same chapter to chapter. And he said, well, you never told me it was ugly. I'm like, well, you are the CEO, right? So, and I said, secondly, you're going to scare away all of our candidates. And he said, only the ones we don't want. And it changed the way we interview the next day. Because the next day, instead of me finding out, did you have the skills and, do you have all the acronyms on your resume that match my job description? Now we're talking about, how do you like to work? How much direction do you want and need, right? How confident are you that you can do a good job without worrying about security all the time, right? So I don't think that everybody needs to write a culture deck, but the more information that people can have, particularly when you're onboarding and hiring people, that they can access and start that conversation, I think that's a really important way to think about. Because we can find out so much information about other companies, but purposefully doing it is a really important thing, I think.
Well, it's interesting. I think that how this is going to affect us in the long term around how we work and where we live. I do know. I was doing an interview with someone else, and they were on the 33rd floor in a 400 square foot apartment in downtown Toronto. And I'm, cruelly sending them listings of backyards in Waterloo region. But do you think we're actually going to get to a point this time where we are going to have the trust necessary that people will actually get to that point of having the option of working virtually?
I think it's going to depend on your company and your product and your inherited culture, right? It's going to depend on who's in charge. If you're in a company that's doing what it's done the way it's always done it, and everybody in charge for the top 3 levels is a 60-year-old white man who's pretty used to doing things the way they do them, I think it's going to be very difficult to change. But I also think, like my story of the CEO who got the great question from the junior person, I think we're going to see people participating that we didn't see through the hierarchy before. I mean, I think it's a great sort of equalizer, the way we're working now. So, it's your conversation also about cities versus suburbs versus countryside. I mean, That will be an interesting one too, because there's a reason people live in cities, because they're vibrant and they're happening and there's so much going on, and there's not. So it will be fascinating, won't it? I'm actually doing a talk this week with Matt Mullenweg, who has the company that works completely virtually and always has. And so it'll be really interesting to learn from him if things changed.
So you mentioned the fact that there's lots of things that are happening, and it's not just about the pandemic. Do you think that this is finally the wake-up call that we needed to address some of the critical issues that we've been dealing with for? I mean,
Yes.
I'm almost 60 years old, and I think back, 50 years, and I would have just assumed that many of these issues would not be things we're dealing with today.
I'm thrilled about it. I think it's really, really hard work. I have been pretty frustrated for the last couple of years going to places where D&I has become D&I and B and D&I and A. And I mean, I'm like, why do we have to call it D&I? It sounds like linens and things. Why do we always turn everything into a catchphrase, right? So diversity is a really important thing, right? We need to have lots of different representation in our organization so that we can respond to our customers, who are very diverse, particularly in America, right? So, but the hard work is not just that. The hard work is listening to each other and making sure everybody gets the same opportunity. And, when the Me Too movement was happening, I remember I got a call it was the week that 3 men in media had gotten fired and 3 women took their place. And this was like USA Today or somebody called me and they said, what do you think about that? And I said, here in the Silicon Valley, people say we'd have more women in leadership, we'd have more women on the board, but it's a pipeline issue, right? There's just not enough qualified women, right? I'm like, look at Matt Lauer. Hoda was sitting next to him. It wasn't that hard. Oh, where will we find someone? I'm like, the people are in front of you. It's not a pipeline issue. You don't have any women working at your company? Hello? So, I mean, I think it's a really, really great opportunity for us.
Yes, I do too. And I think that, we all need to get better. We've got a plan at Communitech. We're going to focus on how do we get better as individuals and dealing with, sort of unlearning a lot of the subconscious bias. We're going to focus on our own organization, making sure there's no systemic discrimination built into any of our hiring process. We're going to look at our programs and how we support underrepresented groups. And then we're going to work on helping to coach our CEOs.
Yeah. And you know what? There is. You just can't help it. I mean, I say when I go and talk about like hiring or recruiting, right? I say, look, here's how job descriptions are written. They either describe somebody who left that you wish hadn't, a fantasy person that doesn't exist, or whatever it takes to get it approved. Okay, so that's the baseline. And then when you talk to a hiring manager about who we should hire, that hiring manager says, I'm looking for somebody who's really smart, quick on their feet, able to make good decisions, great with customers, a good communicator, someone just like me, maybe younger. And like hires. I mean, it is just human nature. And we went through this whole thing out here where, culture meant hire somebody you want to have a beer with. I'm like, look, no. I've hired data scientists all my life, I'm not sure these guys drink beer, but I want them.
So in a way, culture is a bit of a bias.
Yes.
Right? But so maybe the point is, are all biases bad, I guess?
Well, some are. I mean, the bad ones should, I think it's more about, for me as a former executive, right? I have always been in the room when somebody gets hired and somebody gets promoted, always, for, you know, years and years and years and years and years. And I know that at the top in particular, it's familiarity. Oh yeah, I was in a meeting with him and he's so articulate, absolutely would be a great VP someday. And if no one ever says, I was in the room with her, right, then they don't get promoted. That's just how it works. So, I mean, that's the systemic biases that I think are in every organization, which is who's in the room, who's not in the room, what really happens outside of it. I mean, to focus on this conversation, won't it be interesting how those conversations go in the future when being in the room is virtual? Right. I mean, I remember somebody one time at our company who was so, oh man, he was the best presenter on earth. He always had jokes and, you know, interaction with the audience. And it was really great. And I was standing in a meeting one time and talking to somebody, like, they're like, isn't he great? I mean, he's just incredible. I'm like, yeah, see the numbers? They've been the same the last 3 quarters. The presentations get better every quarter. The work's not happening. So it'll be interesting to see how we actually start measuring what's happening now. But back to my incremental metrics as we move along.
So, you know, throughout your career, you have you've really stood HR in its head, and you've challenged a lot of the assumptions, whether it's, you know, performance appraisals or, you know, how we hire and recruit and motivate people. Talk to me a bit about this, you know, this distinction between the issue you have around the word empowerment.
Oh, I think that the reason why we have to call it that and do it now is because we took it all away from everybody. And I think people, I used to say people walk in the door with power, but now they just wake up and get in front of their computer and their jammies with power. So I just don't think it's something we have to give to people. I think it's something that we have to give back to people. You know, since I've left Netflix, I've tried to, and since I've been talking to a lot of HR people now, I'm trying to find a different word for it because human resources is just outdated, it doesn't work. So if I look back to my time at Netflix, I now say I was the COO of the culture, the Chief Operating Officer of the culture. So if I said, yes, I believe we have adults with good judgment and I want them to operate with freedom and responsibility, then do I need a time off policy? Do I need a travel policy? Do I need finance to approve every $10,000 of expenditure for somebody who has a PhD in math and knows what greater than 10,000 is? Right? Or I would say, sometimes I would say, or I was the chief product officer for people. And so I would say, if I want to create a feedback mechanism, because my theory is that feedback enhances people's performance, so you know, it's a hypothetical, and I wanted to create a product to do that, you'd never create the annual performance review. You're going to give somebody feedback once a year in arrears? And then you're going to use that to figure out what to pay them in the future. You know, it's crazy. And so that's where it wasn't that I had all these crazy wild ideas and I did all this incredible invention. It was mostly that I just stopped doing stuff that didn't matter anymore. Compensation. I mean, we could do an hour on compensation. I just did last year in New York, I did a conference with like 1,000 compensation people. 1,000, right? I walk up on stage, I'm like, the door's closed. It's just us. I'm one of you. Please fix equal pay. Go write some checks. Who are you waiting for permission from? Your compensation. It is not brain surgery. If the average male salary is higher than the average female salary per job title, fix it. Then go back home and ask yourself what it is that you're doing that got us here. Because the math doesn't work, right? If I'm a high performing person, the only way I'm going to get paid what I'm worth is to leave. if the market for my skills goes up, then if I'm stuck in a 6.5% merit increase budget and I'm worth 20% more, you're trapped. So this is the part where I'm saying, just think about all those processes, all of those guidelines, all of those procedures, all those best practices.
There's a word that you love, isn't it?
Well, I'm out here where there's always the company du jour. Half of the whole got to have a foosball table in every office and a bartender on staff. That's all Google stuff because they were the cool company. So, we copy each other a lot. So that's what I'm saying. I think that maybe what can come out of this is truly a customized version story about your company and your company culture, so that as people move through their careers, which they will, Canada, maybe it was with you, I did the 1,000 CEOs in the room. And I said, raise your hand if you're in the same job you had when you left university. And of course, no hands went up. And I said, raise your hand if the number one metric that you have for human resources is retention. 999 hands went up. Like, it doesn't seem weird to you. So, their mobility might not just be where you live. It might be changing your careers.
You talk about the distinction. So much of what you say is common sense, and when you're done saying it, of course, we're all nodding, going, "She's absolutely right." Like we just got to use our heads and be, grown-up adults. But tell me about the difference between. You make a distinction between team and family.
Uh-huh.
Just unpack that a bit for me.
I'll go back to my Scotty Bowman story. Teams come together to win for the customer. That's it. It's not that hard, right? I used to tell my HR team, yes, we're a service organization. It's not spelled SERVANTS. And the people we serve don't work here. The people we serve are watching TV. And so we got to make sure that we give the organization the ability to put together fabulous teams of people that create amazing product that people will keep subscribing to month after month, year after year. And we got to get out of the way of them doing that great work. That's what we do, right? We're not somebody's mom or sister or whatever it is. So it's about, I forgot the question.
Family versus teams.
Oh, family versus teams. So, family's undying love. You're going to loan your brother-in-law money and he's never going to pay you back, and you're going to do it so your sister won't be mad, right? Don't do that at work. That's dumb. And, you don't get to pick your family, but you do get to pick your team. And you get, here's another story. I'm at a D&I conference. It's very sensitive. And the coach of the San Antonio Spurs is on stage. And somebody in the audience says, oh, you spend your whole year, finding the best talent in the whole country and putting them in the right places and winning so many games, and they create this spirit and this sense of togetherness. And at the end of the year, at the end of the season, they could be cut from the team. Doesn't that just break your heart? And he goes, no, it's professional basketball. Like, they know. And they get to say they played for the Spurs, right? And they'll have that for the rest of their lives. And I'm in the audience going, how come we can do this with 26-year-old guys and we can't do that with an adult at work? I think your season's over, dude. Where should you play next?
So Patty, you spent a lot of time hanging around with Reed Hastings. What's he like?
Oh, he's different all the time. He's, they just announced last week that he's going to be co-CEO with Ted Sarandos, who's a wonderful guy. And they really are sort of have run the company together for years and years. He is tough. He's very, very honest. He's a visionary. He has no rear view mirror, no nostalgia. It's always forward, 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 forward for Reed. And he takes being a leader very, very seriously. So, I mean, it's his empathy and compassion on top of that big brain and hard driving work ethic that I think is the right combo. But, I've known Reed for 25 years now. And every day he wakes up and wants to be a better leader than he was the day before. And that's the difference.
That's amazing. And of course, now you just get to yell at CEOs for a living.
No, it's funny when people meet me after they read my book, they say, "Oh, you're so nice." We didn't expect you to be warm. Because they think I just go around firing people all the time. Nah, I mean, I love CEOs early in their career. You were asking me earlier about so can you change and what processes have to be there. And I just did a CEO interviewed me last week for a venture firm, right? So these are all, and they all want to ask about the rules. They got 40 people. How much structure we need to have. And I think maybe one thing we can talk about too is on culture. You don't write it down and keep it, right? That's what I hear from young people. How we're the young companies. I don't mean young people. Young companies will say, "We love our startup culture. It's so much fun. How do we keep it that way?" And I tell them, "You don't." So one of my stories that's in my book is this is early on, we were maybe 100 people. And one of my engineers said, "I don't think management understands that everything's changing and it's not like it used to be. And we don't know each other's names and everybody doesn't know what everybody else is doing. Management doesn't understand that the culture's changing." And I said, "Rob, I'm a vice president and I report to the CEO. And you and I have had this conversation 7 times. So the first part of your sentence, management doesn't know, is completely untrue because I'm management and I know." Okay. The second part is, yeah, it's true. Things are changing all the time. Do you know what we want to be when we grow up? And he said, "Well, I know we want to be successful." I said, "A global corporation." He just kind of like, that's what we want to be. It's not going to be like it is now. You know why things are changing? Because we're successful. And oh, by the way, you're kind of a startup guy. You're kind of a 50-person company guy, and you can keep doing that for the rest of your life. Really, you won't ever be working in a successful global corporation because they don't exist at 50 people.
Why do you think people cling to, nostalgia?
I think people cling to it because it's fun, right? I mean, that's the whole point of what we did. We had a layoff. Then the company got really successful and we were doing twice as much work with 1/3 as many people. And it was fun. I mean, we were just killing it. It was like, oh my God, what's happening here? What's deep underneath here? And that's when we wrote the chapter on high performance, which was, man, we had the right people in the right jobs. It was rocking, and people knew exactly what to do because it was life or death. And so people were just freedom and response. All this stuff was happening. And I remember about a year into that, we were about to go public. And I looked at my finance team and I had like 3 people who had worked in a public company. And I thought, oh no. They're the wrong team. And they were wonderful people. But, it's, that. I mean, it's a completely different story. All of a sudden, you're a public company and GAAP accounting and all that kind of, we were doing stuff with, spreadsheets, figuring out how to pay the studios. So we had to kind of up level the team. And so the culture the point I want to make about culture is, you have to look forward and come back to the team that you have and be really clear about where you're going on a really constant basis. And you have to pay attention to it, right? You really literally have to sit down and spend time and say, who are we? How are we acting with each other? Is it the way we want to be? Do we want to change behavior? How are we going to do that at the top first so that other people can see it? And so it's just this evolving. Netflix has rewritten doesn't have the culture deck anymore. It's a new document. And the new document includes a lot of stuff about cultural difference and global diversity, and Netflix is mostly a content company now, right? So it's a completely different company than when I left 8 years ago. And that's wonderful. I mean, right? And it's a completely different team by and large. So that's the part where if you're a leader, if you're a CEO, it's your job to steer the culture forever.
And don't have a rear view mirror. Patty, thank you so much for joining us here today. It was wonderful to catch up with you again. Hope we can do this sooner rather than later.
Me too.
I also wanted to take an opportunity to thank all of our viewers for tuning in today, and we'll see you here next Tuesday.
Thanks for watching this episode of True North TV. Subscribe to Communitech's YouTube channel to get notified of future episodes of True North TV.